Have you ever noticed that you can talk to two different people and get just two completely different viewpoints on the same experience or the same event? Like, do this little thought experiment. Imagine you have friends who just come back from a Caribbean vacation. So a married couple, they were on vacation, and you see them a couple of weeks after vacation. You see the husband, and you say, hey, how was your trip? I haven't seen you since your trip. How was your trip? And he's like, he kind of gets a frown, kind of shrugs his shoulders. You know, the resort was nice, but you remember that tropical storm? It was going by right while we were down there, so pretty much it just rained the whole week. And we spent like half a day at the beach, and then we were supposed to go parasailing, never happened. We were supposed to go on this excursion to a waterfall, never happened. We were just stuck inside the whole time. I couldn't help. The whole week I just spent, wondering why I'd spent the money. You're like, oh man, I'm so sorry to hear that. Man, I hope you get the chance to go again. I hope it's better, if you do get to go again. And a couple days later, you see the wife. And you're like, hey, I heard it was raining while you were on vacation. I'm so sorry to hear that. And she's like, yeah, the rain was a bummer. But I got to tell you, the resort was so nice. And we got to sleep in every morning. We didn't have any agenda. And we ordered room service. And it was, things are so busy around here. And now it was just the two of us. And we don't get to spend time like that with just the two of us ever. Honestly, I think it was the best vacation we ever had. And you're like, wait a minute, who'd you go with again? Right? I mean, two different people, same event, same experience, just two completely different viewpoints. What makes the difference? It's the story they tell, right? It's the story they're telling themselves. It's the way they choose to look at the things that happened. What you say to yourself, it matters. Last week, in last week's sermon, I read a quote from a man named Paul David Tripp. He said, nobody talks to you more than you. He said, nobody's more influential in your life than you are, because the voice you hear more than any other voice is the voice inside your head. So what you say to yourself matters. It influences the way you see the world. Heard about a study where researchers took a group of volunteers, divided them in half. And in the first half, they asked to keep an irritation journal. An irritation journal. For 10 weeks, they were supposed to carry a notebook around and just write down everything that bothered them. If something annoyed them, if something upset them, they were supposed to write it in the journal, an irritation journal. So, right, some of us do that already, right? I mean, not that we write it down, but some of us, we're keeping track in our head, right? We're logging all the annoyances, all those things. Some of us do write it down. That's called Facebook. But for 10 weeks, they were supposed to just write down everything that bothered them, everything that irritated them. The other half, they asked to keep a gratitude journal. And so, same deal, they were supposed to carry a notebook around, but for 10 weeks, they were supposed to write down everything they were grateful for, everything that put a smile on their face, everything that made them happy. And going into it, they had this questionnaire. They had everybody take this questionnaire about their satisfaction with life, and then they gave them the same questionnaire 10 weeks later after this, and well, guess what happened? Right? I mean, they predicted the people who keep the gratitude journal are going to be happier, right? But the report I said the researchers were astonished at how much of a difference there was between the two groups. They had all these metrics to measure their satisfaction with life, their satisfaction with their relationships, how well they sleep at night, their overall health. And for those who kept the gratitude journal, 10 weeks later, they all reported they were happier, more satisfied, sleeping better at night. For those who kept the irritation journal, they all reported after 10 weeks that they were sleeping less, that they were less satisfied with life, less satisfied with their relationships. What they said to themselves made a huge difference. In fact, they found that the people who participated said, the longer it went on, first few days I hardly found anything to write down that bugged me, that bothered me. But by the end, they were writing, sheets of paper, right? The more they trained themselves to look for things that bothered them, the more they found. Same thing in reverse. The more they looked for things to be thankful for, the more they found. What we say to ourselves matters. So that's the main idea behind the series of sermons we're in now. I'm calling it Preach to Yourself. Because it's a reminder that the things we tell ourselves have power. But more than simply, a sermon series about looking on the bright side of things. Like, oh, the rain meant we got to spend more time together. More than just trying to count up more things to be grateful for than to be irritated by. More than just looking on the bright side of things. My goal in this series is to challenge you, to challenge us, challenge all of us, to remind ourselves of the deep truths of the Bible. To preach to ourselves the good news of who God is and what God does. So what we're going to do for this series, it's going to go till mid-March or mid-February, somewhere in there, the beginning of Lent. What we're going to do is each week we're going to look at what I'm calling yet I passages of Scripture. Yet I. Passages where the biblical author is contemplating some difficult state of affairs, but then reminds himself of God's truth. And so the passages I looked for they all follow this sort of formula. I tried to come up with a formula to help you kind of visualize this and see what we're looking for. And so the formula I came up with is that what we're going to start with is a painful reality. We start with an honest assessment of how things are, the facts on the ground, if you will. And in most of these passages, it's going to be a pretty raw assessment. We're going to look at some situations that are not good. But then will come the yet I. We're going to see how that expression, or it's not always going to be exactly that expression, but it'll be similar. We're going to see how the author gets a hold of himself, gets his own attention and starts to say, hey, listen up. Listen up. There are bigger ideas we need to keep in mind. There's a different perspective that we can't lose sight of. Things are bad, the passage will say, yet I must remember this. And then will come God's greater reality. The biblical truth about God that the author is preaching to himself and preaching to us about. And these are the things, hopefully, that we'll be able to put into our own toolkits so that as we encounter these difficult, painful realities of life, we will be able to preach to ourselves the same truth. And so the passage we're going to look at today is one of the best examples of a yet I passage in Scripture. It's also probably the one that's written under the grimmest of circumstances. It's Lamentations chapter 3, verses 19 through 24. And it says this. It says, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them. My soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, therefore I have hope. And there's the yet I. Right? There's the change. There's the getting a hold of himself, speaking to himself. Yet I remember this. And it gives me hope. Verse 22. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. The big idea today is simple, yet it is profound. We can have hope even in the midst of our greatest afflictions. We can have hope. We can have hope even when our world is crumbling down around us. My outline today is going to be simple. I'm just going to follow the yet I formula I just gave you. We're going to start with the painful reality. We're going to touch base with the yet I, and then we're going to see God's deeper reality that we need to hold on to. So first, the painful reality. The book of Lamentations is an interesting book. This is not necessarily a book that we spend a lot of time in when we're doing our Bible reading. It's not a happy book. A lament is a passionate expression of pain or sorrow. A lament is, there are other laments in the Bible. This whole book is lament. It's an entire book of painful expressions of pain and sorrow, but there are other psalms that are psalms of lament. There are others scattered around the Old Testament. There's a tradition within Israel of being really honest with God. These people who wrote our Bibles were not afraid to tell God how they felt, to express anger towards God. Really, a lament is a complaint. It's going to God with your pain and your sorrow, and you're really pouring it back out onto God, and that's what this is. So the book of Lamentations, if you want to think of it this way, the book of Lamentations is the Bible's complaint department. It's sort of the customer service center where the author of Lamentations has walked in. He's not happy with the service he's getting. He wants to, who could I talk to about this? That's how the book of Lamentations reads. So it's an interesting book because it's a book of complaint. And it's also an interesting book because it has an interesting structure. There are 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations, and chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5 all have exactly 22 verses. And that's interesting because there are exactly 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And so chapters 1, 2, and 4, each verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It doesn't show up in English, right, because they couldn't translate it that way. But if we could read Hebrew, we'd see that each verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's an acrostic. That's what they call it. And then the 5th chapter has 22 verses also, but it doesn't follow that pattern. And scholars actually think that's intentional of, exactly the same number of verses, but then showing the sort of the disequilibrium that comes from lament and that sort of thing. And so chapter 3 is unique because instead of 22 verses, chapter 3 has 66 verses. So 3 times the number, and it follows the acrostic pattern as well, but its verses are grouped into three verses, then the next 3 are the next letter, and the next 3 are the next letter, and within each of those groups of 3, each line starts with the same letter of the alphabet. So it's an interesting, complex sort of work of art, and it wouldn't be so dissimilar to when we give our first or second graders an assignment, or we give them the alphabet, and we say, okay, come up with a word that starts with each letter, right? A is for apple, B is for buffalo, C is for car, and so on. And that's what Lamentations is like, only instead of just come up with a word for each letter of the alphabet, it's like, okay, come up with everything that bugs you about the world. It's an irritation journal, right? Come up with everything that you hate in the world, and come up. A is for abuse. B is for bankruptcy. C is for cancer. D is for divorce, and so on and so on. Now, we don't know who the author of Lamentations is. Technically, Lamentations is an anonymous book. But traditionally, it's been associated with the prophet Jeremiah. In fact, so much so that the Old Testament categorizing, the way the Old Testament is organized is not chronologically, but the books are put kind of in categories. So you got your history books, and you've got your poetry books, and you've got your prophet books. And so Lamentations is a book of poetry, but it's not categorized with the other books of poetry. So closely is the association with Jeremiah that we find the book of Lamentations in our Bible right in the prophecy section right after Jeremiah. And that makes sense because even if Jeremiah is not the actual author, the book is so clearly connected to him and the events of his life that people just assume he wrote it or somebody wrote it in his name. And so for the rest of the sermon, I'm just going to assume Jeremiah is the author of Lamentations. And Jeremiah's deal is this. He was called to be a prophet to the nation of Judah in the years leading up to the exile. So he had this long career as a prophet, 4 to 5 decades, 40 to 50 years, where he served as a prophet, where it was his job to warn the people of Judah to change their ways or face destruction. His book, Jeremiah, is the longest book in the Bible by word count, and it covers 40 to 50 years of preaching this message of destruction, and he's known as the weeping prophet. Known as the weeping prophet for a couple of reasons. One, because that message of coming destruction it's a hard message to preach. It's a sad message to declare to people. He's known as the weeping prophet because his message tended to fall on deaf ears. People didn't want to hear what he had to say for 40 to 50 years. He preached to an audience that didn't want to listen. There are times when he wants to throw in the towel. He tells God, I quit. And God says, no, you don't quit till I tell you you quit. And he just kept preaching. He said the word burned in his bones like fire. He couldn't keep it in anymore. At one point, people he's preaching to take him and throw him in a dry cistern to shut him up. So he's known as the weeping prophet for that reason. But probably the main reason he's known as the weeping prophet is because his message came true. Despite his decades of warning, the people refused to listen. And in 587 BC, while Jeremiah is still alive, the Babylonians roll into Jerusalem and destroy it. Tear down the city walls, they desecrate the temple, they take the best and the brightest and the youngest citizens of Judah, frog march them off to Babylon into exile. Everybody else is left to deal with the fallout of the destruction and kind of face the deprivations and the deprecations that come when you are subject to invasion and defeat, rape, starvation, famine, death of those you care about, living in unstable structures, the whole ball of wax. And Jeremiah, instead of, being like, I told you so, right? He could have been like, well, I've been telling you guys, you wouldn't listen. See, throw me in a well, will you? Well, no, he's not like that. Instead, Jeremiah is utterly devastated by what happens because this is his city. And these are his people. He wasn't preaching judgment against them because he was mad at him. He wasn't preaching judgment against them because he hated them. He was preaching judgment because he was begging them to change. And so when Jeremiah is left behind in the aftermath, he is just undone by what he sees. Everywhere he looks, what he sees is death and destruction. He sees people weeping over dead loved ones. He sees young men, young women being lined up in chains to make the long march to Babylon. He sees the treasure houses of Judah torn open and plundered. He sees, even according to Lamentations 4:10, he even sees people resorting to cannibalism just to survive. In fact, I thought about putting that verse on the screen, and I decided against it because it's that awful. So I just pictured Jeremiah walking around this city, taking in the stench of death, smoke, watching people digging through garbage to try to find a meal, watching people fighting with each other over scraps. And then he gets to his little writing desk or whatever, and he sits down and he tries to describe what he saw and what he sees and what he's experienced and what he feels, and he doesn't even know where to start. So he just starts with the alphabet. A, B, C. The thing is, Jeremiah's theology is good. He knows that God is still in control. In fact, because it was his job to deliver God's message of warning, he knows exactly why this happened and who's responsible. I mean, he knows that what Jerusalem has just experienced has come from God's hand. And he's not afraid to say that. He's not afraid to point his finger back at God and say, what I'm experiencing now, God, that is your fault. You've done this to me. Chapter 3, verse 1, I am the man who's seen affliction. By the rod of the Lord's wrath, he has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he's turned his hand against me again and again all day long. Jeremiah just walked into the complaint department and he said, I want to see the manager. Verses 10 through 12, he compares God to a predatory animal. He says it feels like God has been using him for target practice. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding. He dragged me from the path and he mangled me and he left me without help. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. This is raw, devastating stuff. Jeremiah is suffering, and he's not afraid to pour his suffering back out to God. Verses 19 and 20 give us a picture of his mental and physical state. He says, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember that my soul is downcast within me. He's depressed. He's bitter. He's got ulcers that won't shut off. He's got acid churning in his stomach. He is physically ill. Bitterness and gall. Now, I want to be careful in finding parallels to our own lives here. Because I don't want to cheapen this passage by comparing it to the irritations and annoyances we sometimes face. I don't want to take this passage, and compare it to like the momentary flash of pain we feel when we stub our toe. Jeremiah didn't just stub his toe here. Right? I don't want the application of this passage being, when we deal with these things we call first world problems. Like, we're sitting there waiting for our internet to connect and it's really slow and we're like, oh, the affliction and the gall. I don't want to cheapen it like that. Jeremiah is writing about people who've just had their city destroyed by an invading army. By God's grace, that's something we will never experience, but people in our world right now, today, have and do experience this sort of thing. So I do not want to cheapen this. But maybe there are some parallels in your own life, some times where you can think of where it felt like your world was just utterly falling apart around you. Like the time you got a phone call. Found out somebody you care about, somebody close to you, just got a devastating cancer diagnosis. And it's not going to be treatable. And that time you came home and your spouse is waiting for you at the door with papers in hand. So that's it, I'm out, I quit. I mean, that time you're sitting at the table, you got your spreadsheets spread out in front of you, and no matter what you do, you can't make the numbers work, and you realize this thing that you've given your life to, this thing, this dream you've had, this business you've built is just not going to survive. I'm not sure what exactly makes for an appropriate parallel. I want you to remember that this is big. This is devastating. The painful reality is that Jeremiah's world is caving in around him, and he knows that God had a hand in it. And yet, blaming God does not mean Jeremiah is turning away from God. Here's the remarkable thing about lament. I heard this week that lament, here's what happens when you lament. Either you're going to be pushed away from God, or lament's going to draw you closer to Him. Right? So by engaging with God, by pouring out their complaint to God, the Israelites were not running away from God. They were like, no, God, I'm not letting you off the hook. We're going to figure this out. We're going to figure this out together. In Jeremiah's theology, it's God's judgment that actually becomes the seedbed for his hope, because the way Jeremiah rationalizes it is if God's been faithful to fulfill his judgment against evil, then that means God will also be faithful to keep his covenant promise that evil doesn't get the final say in the end. And so verse 21, the yet I of this passage, Jeremiah says, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. There's an incredible change of tone at this point in the book of Lamentations. There's such a dramatic change of tone, in fact, that some scholars today doubt that this was original. Right? There's such a change in the way that the passage talks about God. He's been attacking God. He's been complaining to God. And suddenly he starts talking about God in these positive terms. And they say, no. That's a later editor who just wants to soften this thing so it fits their theology better. But that can't be. Because remember what I said about the acrostic? Remember what I said about the pattern? Every third verse, another letter of the alphabet? This is the way Jeremiah wrote this. This is the way he wants it to read. Jeremiah is saying, I'm not going to let my affliction get the last word. I'm going to talk to myself. I'm going to preach to myself. And here's what he says. Because the Lord's great love were not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. Here then is how we can have hope even in the midst of our greatest afflictions. Here's what we can preach to ourselves. Here's God's greater reality. 3 things. First, we need to preach to ourselves that God's mercies are new every morning. Verses 22 and 23, because of the Lord's great love, we're not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. 2 words to pay attention to here. The first word, the one translated great love, that's a Hebrew word I've talked about before. That's the Hebrew word chesed. That's the Old Testament's greatest word for describing the love of God, God's covenant faithfulness, God's commitment to his people, his chesed, his unfailing love. It's sort of the Old Testament equivalent of the New Testament word for grace. And the other word is compassion. In the original language, that comes from a root word that references a mother's womb. So the word picture there is the way a mother cares for her child. That's God's compassion over us, his children. And so I wanted to combine those two words, come up with a word that captured them both. I went with mercy. From the hymn, morning by morning, new mercies I see. And that's the key point being made here, that God's mercies are new. God's love, God's compassions are new every morning. And that's a word that means new but different. So it's not just new, more of the same, new days. What's the second verse? Same as the first. It's new but different. It's a new kind of mercy. It's fresh mercy. It's mercy that's perfectly tailored to the needs of that day. John Piper writes this. He says this: the strength to live tomorrow will be given tomorrow, not today. And it will be given. Our task today is not to have the strength needed for tomorrow's burdens. Our task today is to live by the mercies given for today and to believe that there will be new mercies for tomorrow. Today's mercies do not include strength for tomorrow. They include faith that tomorrow's unseen mercies will be sufficient for tomorrow. He says this truth will save you again and again if you grasp it, if you live by it. Because how many times in life do we come to the end of our resources and say, there isn't anything here anymore. I'm depleted. One more straw and this camel's back will break. And we despair that tomorrow will just be rolled into today's depleted condition. And at that moment, we desperately need this truth. God will not expect you to carry one more straw with these present mercies. When the next straw is added, the mercies will be new. His mercies are new day by day, morning by morning. Second, we need to preach to ourselves that God is faithful. If you haven't figured it out yet, this passage in Lamentations is the source for that hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. So that's the next line in verse 23, Great is your faithfulness, O God. When you or I apply for a new job, one of the first things our potential new employer wants is a list of past places we've worked, contact information for references. Why? Because past performance is a good indicator of future behavior. The same thing works for God, right? Your track record. Our employers want to know our track record. Well, we have a track record with God, and we know that since He's been faithful in the past, we can count on Him to be faithful in the future. When young David volunteered to go out and fight Goliath, King Saul had serious doubts about his ability to survive. And so David replies, when he's trying to convince Saul to let him go to take on the giant, how does he answer Saul? He says, when I was out in the pasture, in my father's pasture, caring for my father's sheep, the lion would come at me, the bear would come at me, and the Lord delivered me from them. He says, the same God who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David looked at God's track record of faithfulness in the past, and he applied it to his future. At a staff meeting this week, Beth shared 2 Timothy 2, verse 13. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Such a good verse. Faithfulness is so essential to who God is that it's not possible for him to be unfaithful, because for him to be unfaithful would mean he would disown who he is. He can't do it. Several years ago, I read about a woman named Gladys Allward who served as a missionary in China before World War II. So when the Japanese began World War II by invading northern China, she was forced to flee, taking with her about 100 orphans. And she headed up into the mountains, and she was trying to get away from these hostile forces. She despaired of ever getting these children anywhere near safety. And a little 13-year-old girl comes up to her and says, "Don't despair. Remember Moses and the Red Sea crossing." And the missionary says, "Yeah, but I'm not Moses." And the little girl says, "Of course you're not Moses, but Jehovah is still God. God is faithful. You can trust him." And then third, we need to preach to ourselves that God is enough. Verse 24, I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The word portion in the Bible has to do with inheritance. It's a person's share, a person's possession. So it comes from the book of Numbers when Moses is dividing the promised land up among the 12 tribes of Israel. When he gets to the Levites who are going to serve in the temple, he doesn't have a portion of land for them. God says, you don't get any land because I'm your portion. I'm your portion. Jeremiah now says, the Lord is my portion. When we use that word portion in English, we're usually thinking food. A portion is a serving size. Usually it implies if you got the right size portion, it'll be just enough. It'll be exactly what you need to satisfy your hunger. Like Goldilocks, it'll be just right. And so when Jeremiah thinks about God being his portion, he's thinking about something he may not fully possess right now, but something he knows will be irrevocably his forever in the future, his inheritance. And he knows it will be enough. He knows it'll be just right. It'll be something that will satisfy him. Remember, Jeremiah is writing about people who are starving, literally considering cannibalism just to survive. These are people who are thinking to themselves, if I could just have something to fill my belly, if I could just, that would be my portion, that would be enough, if I could just have something to eat. So often we say something similar, right? If I could just have this thing. If this dream would just come true, if this thing would happen, if my spouse would just change, if my health would just get better, if I could just change to a better job, if I could have this thing, then that would be my portion, then I'd be satisfied, that would be enough. And Jeremiah says, no, you won't be satisfied. It won't be enough because only the Lord is enough. Only the Lord is your portion. Therefore, you must wait for Him. I heard this quote by Charles Spurgeon this week. It's so good. He's writing about this passage in Lamentations. He's writing to a group of people who have experienced grief and sorrow. They've lost someone close to them. He says this, you have lost much, but you've not lost your portion. Your God is your all. Therefore, if you have lost everything except God, you still have your all left, since God is all. The text does not say that God is only part of our portion, but the whole portion. So imagine that it's daylight and the sun is shining bright and I'm holding a lighted candle. Someone blows it out. Should I sit down and cry because my candle has been extinguished? No, not while the sun's shining. God is my portion. If I lose some small earthly comfort, I will not complain, for heavenly comfort remains. I do not make light of our earthly afflictions. Neither does the Bible. If I have one dispute with this quote, it would be with that phrase, if I lose some little earthly comfort, as if to imply that if we lose something on this earth, it's just a small thing. Sometimes the afflictions we face, they are no small things. I'm not making light of that, and I'm not asking you to just look on the bright side or look for a silver lining or just count your blessings or anything trivial like that. Sometimes our painful reality is nothing but that. It's painful. But I am asking you to look beyond that reality to a greater reality. To preach God's truth to yourself. To remember that anything we lose in this world is merely a candle compared to the sunlight that is the love of God. And again, that's not because our hurts are small, but because God's love is that big. Remind yourself that His mercies are new every morning. Remember that He's faithful. Preach to yourself that He is indeed enough. We're going to end the service a little differently this morning. An author and preacher who I like and respect a great deal is Kyle Idleman. He's a preaching pastor at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville. So several times as a church, we've done Bible studies that he's had a hand in producing. We have several of his books in our library. So Kyle Idleman is somebody, when I'm preparing a sermon, I'll often look to see if he's preached on the same passage. And if he does, I'll take a listen if I have the time. And so this week, as I was working on this passage, I sat down on Google and I typed in Kyle Idleman Lamentations, and I got a YouTube video back, and it was called, I Say to Myself. based on verse 24 from this passage, and I saw that, and I literally pumped a fist in my office, because not only does he have a sermon on the passage, but he even took the same angle at it that I was taking. So I gave it a listen. And he ends his sermon by telling a story about a young woman in his church. And normally I wouldn't do this. Normally I wouldn't have you come here to listen to me preach, then put a video up of somebody else preaching and have you listen to that. Normally I wouldn't do that. But this story is so powerful. And it's such a good picture of what I've just been talking about that I just want to leave you. I'll come back up after we watch this video, but I just want to leave you with this.
I want to close my message by telling you about a remarkable young lady who's a part of our church family. Her name is Jana Roby, and Jana is 21 years old. I've known her and her parents since she was in kindergarten. In 2014, she was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer, and she's had years of suffering and chemo and radiation and surgeries. And there were a couple of years where there was no sign of the disease, and it looked like God had answered our prayers and had healed her. But then it came back, and now it's in her brain. And cancer has taken so much from her. And she went from being a star field hockey player to being bound to a wheelchair. And she went from having long, beautiful hair to having no hair. And she can't hear out of one ear, and she can't see out of one eye, and she has paralysis on one side of her face. But here's the thing about Jana. It's hard to get that girl to complain. I was interviewing her a few weeks ago for my podcast, and I kind of wanted her to complain. I wanted her to tell the story, to share some of the trauma, the difficult parts, but she just instinctively didn't do it. And so I'd ask her about something, and she'd say, well, I have to tell you about the way God has worked in this situation, how God has used me with this nurse. I pushed her a little bit more, trying to complain just a little bit. And she wanted to tell me about how her family's been loved and cared for by the church and school and friends and family. It's getting a little frustrated, really. I said, Jana, what was it like when you lost your hair? And she explained. She said it was hard. And actually, I'll never be able to grow my hair back. But then she said, with complete sincerity, but that's okay, because I really do like hats. What do you say to yourself? Because she says to herself, God is faithful. He's working things for good. I see it. She says to herself, we are loved, to all kinds of support from people. She says to herself, I like hats. It's hard for her to get out of the house very often. I'm thankful that she can be with us in this worship service. She spends a lot of time at home, and she spends some of her time at home writing songs. What kind of songs? Worship songs. And so we recorded her singing one of the songs that she has written. I asked her if I could end this message by sharing a video of her singing it with you. I hope you'll listen to the lyrics and what she says to herself. The name of the song is You Are My Joy.
The reason I wrote this song is because although I've been through lots of feeling sick and treatments and lots of valleys, the Lord has constantly been there for me and has given me this joy that is unexplainable except for Him. This is called You're My Joy. You're my joy through the pain, through the darkness, through the rain. When my fears are right before me, I have peace 'cause you are for me.
I like hats. When we hear somebody who goes through something like that give an answer like that, we're so moved, right, to have that kind of joyful attitude even in the middle of that. It's a great answer. But it's a silver lining answer. I mean, ultimately, it's a shallow answer. I like hats. I tell you, if you asked her and she was honest, Jana would tell you that liking hats ain't enough for what she went through. It's not a justification for what she experienced. It's not hats that gets her through it. And I know that's what she'd tell you, because she didn't sing her song about hats. She sang about Jesus. He's her joy. He's her portion. He's enough. A day of affliction's coming for all of us. Some of us, we've had our days. What do you tell yourself? His mercies are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. He's enough. As you go, Lord Jesus Christ, go with you. May he go before you to guide you, above you to watch over you. May he go behind you to protect you, beneath you to lift you up. May he go beside you to befriend you. Most of all, may he go within you to give you his peace. Even so, Maranatha, come quickly, Lord Jesus. Amen.